there, what happens in the story? What is the story about? Forget authorship for a second. Forget J, forget E, forget any of that other stuff. What's going on in this story? Testing. What'd you say? Testing. What else is going
How
on?
much power God has.
Good. So there's an issue here about power. Good. What else?
To me, it's about the end of human sacrifice.
Okay, good. So there is some element here about a question. What is the relationship of human sacrifice in the ancient world to this story? Good. What else?
Extreme faith.
Good. Blind faith, extreme faith, obedience. Yep.
What kind of God we pray to?
Good. Who is this God that Abraham has a relationship with, that we have a relationship to? How could such a God ask such a request, or actually it's not really a request, a command to do this? All right, what else?
How could Isaac go along with it?
How could Isaac go along with it? What
How
else?
old was he at the time?
Okay, good. How old is
You
he?
understand what was happening?
All right, let's look at Abraham for just a second. What do we know about Abraham that makes this story seem out of place?
Well, he refused with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Good. With Sodom and Gomorrah, what happens?
Well, he doesn't want all the people to be destroyed, and here's his favorite son, and so it's in contrast with him speaking against sort of a directive that he felt was unfair and unjustified.
Right. So why in that case that's unjustified and seems unfair does Abraham vocalize his frustration, his opposition? Does he bargain with God? But here there seems to be nothing. Nothing, yeah?
Now, the Sodom and Gomorrah story happens afterward, doesn't it?
No, it just happened. It happened a couple chapters before.
All right.
Which makes it even more.
So he bargained, he negotiated.
Yes, he negotiates.
Here he just...
Let's look at Abraham broad strokes for a second. When we first meet Abraham in Genesis 12, and God says to Abraham to go, what is Abraham's reaction?
You just go.
He just does it, right? Why? Because God said so. All right, and then we have the story about him going into Egypt, and he pawns off his wife as his sister, doesn't really intervene in the whole thing, and he just kind of lets things happen. He's a pretty passive character in many ways. And then we have the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah where he seems to speak up, to vocalize, but we also have the story of Hagar and Ishmael. Right? Initially, whose idea is it for Abraham to have a son with Hagar? It's Sarah's idea. So being the dutiful husband that he is, he listens to his wife, as he is supposed to, and has a son, and then immediately what happens when she gets pregnant? He sends her away. Why? Because Sarah is jealous. But don't worry, they come back. She's supposed to give in. And then all of a sudden they do have a son named Ishmael. Sarah gets pregnant. The kids grow up. They have some tension of some sort. And then what does Sarah tell them to do again? And then immediately thereafter, after this whole story happens, God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son. The son that he had prayed for, that he had hoped for, that he was yearning for, that he was promised in his old age. After everything else that happened, he's told to sacrifice his son. And this is our story. Yeah.
While reading the first half of chapter 22,
Yep.
to me it almost seems as though Abraham knows what God is up to. That he's going through this because he knows it's not going to end badly.
Okay.
He's almost following the script.
Yep. Great.
Because God's already told him that his line will go through that.
Right.
But there's Ishmael.
So there's Ishmael, but they have the promise. There seems to be competing tensions here.
But
Yeah.
then why, if you make that assumption, why bother?
Right.
I mean, if you think it's all going to, it's been promised.
So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause you. How many of you have read this story before? How many of you have read it more than once? How many of you read it every year on Rosh Hashanah? How many of you read it during the weekly cycle? How many of you get clarity every time that you read it to try to understand something different about it? So part of the struggle I have with this portion is every time I read it I have to come up with something new to teach about it, or I just skip it altogether.
Well, this is new. The redacted version is a new...
We're going to get to the redaction in just a second.
Can I go to the historical part of it?
Wait 1 minute, then we're going to go to the historical.
I'm interested why you said what you said, Bob. What in the text leads you to believe that he thinks it's
He's
just
so
a sham?
nonchalant about it, for one thing, it
Yep.
seems. Also,
He said God will provide.
yeah, when
His sacrifice.
Isaac asks, here's the fire in the wood, where's the sheep? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep and burnt offering, my son. That's exactly what happens.
However, there's something very important that you have to look at. Go to verse 2. After he's called, he says to him, take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and make him a burnt offering there on one of the mountains that I'll say to you. There seems to be very clear evidence in the text that God is talking about Isaac being the offering. And then when they get up, they take the wood for the burnt offering, but there's no sacrifice. Don't you think that Isaac can put two and two together? He's not so young that he can't understand what's going
He
on.
was an adult, wasn't he?
Wasn't he 30?
Well, he carried the wood. He had
No one knows for certain. He's definitely not a baby, and he's probably somewhere between his adolescence and maybe 30s, early 30s, yeah.
So is it, the Hebrew, the English is not very clear.
No.
It says make, it could be read make of him or make for him.
All right, so let's look in the Hebrew. For those who want to see it, it's on page 118 in the Red Chumashim. It says, Kachna et bincha yechicha asher ahavta Yitzchak, which Rashi does this amazing thing with, and he says that each one of these phrases is worth questioning. He says, Kachna et bincha. What do you mean, take your son? Which son? I have two sons. Et yechidcha, your favored one. What do you mean, my favored one? I have two sons. I favor both of them. Asher ahavta. The one that you love. What do you mean? I love both of them. And Yitzchak. Oh, okay. And then it says in Hebrew, V'lech lecha. Go for yourself. Where else do we see lech lecha? At the very beginning of the story. You could make the argument, literarily speaking, that this story intentionally bookends the time when Abraham left. It uses similar language. And it says, El Eretz HaMoriah, to the land of Moriah, V'ha'alehu sham le'olah. And take him, lift him up there as an olah. What's an olah?
To rise up from.
Well, it does mean to rise up from the word aliyah. What else does it mean?
It's a burnt offering.
It's a burnt offering. It's one of the kinds of sacrifices that we're introduced to in the book of Leviticus. It seems very explicit. That's what we're talking about here.
It's hot, too.
Right? Lift him up. Who are we talking about? We're talking about Isaac, and make him a burnt offering. Okay. I want to pause you for a second. In general, when we read the story, we come up with all kinds of interesting interpretations. It's a test of faith, it's a test of loyalty or obedience, it's about ending child sacrifice. We come up with all kinds of things. I want to now take a second, take a look at the document I made for you. I gathered from our discussion last week that this entire new concept of authorship is very confusing for some people. Or, I'll put it a different way, for some it's over your head. It's even over my head at times. One of the things when you study a text like this that we often do is we come up with all kinds of interpretations. It's about loyalty, it's about faith, it's about blind faith, it's about trust, it's about the will of God, it's about ending sacrifices. These are all traditional interpretations of the texts that we get from classic commentators. So usually when we interpret this text, does anyone remember the interfaith panel we have on Rosh Hashanah? And Christy Denham, who's a reverend of the Church of Belmont, you know what she said about this text theologically? I don't know, so we just skip it.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Okay? That's what she said at the text. Because it's so theologically complicated that there is no other answer than to just say, you know what, I don't want to deal with it. When we deal with this text traditionally, we look at all the commentaries and the interpretations and we try to figure out what's going on here. Maybe it was the end of child sacrifice. Maybe it was the 10th test, right? There was Shalom Spiegel wrote a book called The 10 Trials, right, which was all about Abraham being tested 10 times. And it's based on interpretations from Rashi and from Maimonides, who said that Abraham was tested 10 different ways from the moment that he left his home. And all of that was about entering into a relationship with God. But there's another way to interpret the text, which is through a critical way. That's what this class is about. It's understanding, does the critical way of how the text was written inform the way that we understand it? So here's what I gave you. At the top, I gave you a chart. I found this from the University of Pennsylvania in their religious studies department. They created a chronology of what we have been calling J, E, P, and D. J and E are the oldest sources. D and P are later sources, and it's not entirely clear which one came first. Although many people think it was D, and that the priestly system happens around the focus of worship in the temple and sacrifices because it involved the priests and the Levites. And then sometime after the second temple was destroyed, until about 400 BCE. All of them were brought together into one narrative. And if you look on the second page that I gave you on the back of it, I gave you just a quick summary of the documentary hypothesis, the fragmentary hypothesis, the supplementary hypothesis, and some of the major people that play a role in how this document comes together. Our class is focusing on the idea that maybe what we have been reading all along was not just a story about faith, or tests, or obedience, or loyalty, or ending sacrifice, or whatever, but it was actually different stories that got strung together to make one story. And we're going to see that in just a second in the story we just read. For those of you who like, I also gave you an overview. I got this from Friedman, from my own learning, from whatever, of what is J, E, P, and D. Who are they? What are their primary qualities or characterizations? So look at J for a second. J typically uses what name of God? Yahweh or Adonai. It's also the name that we call the Tetragrammaton, the Yud He Vav He. Right? It is derived from the southern kingdom, meaning Judah. Right? Remember, if you think about your history, if you want to see, I gave you a timeline on this third page. If you look on the third page of your packet, 1200 to 1000 BCE is roughly the settlement of the tribes, what we'll call the post-Exodus. After leaving Egypt, they come to Israel and they settle into the tribes. So if you look on a map of Israel in the ancient world, like in the back of your Chumash, you'll see here's Manasseh, here's Yisachar, here's Zebulun, here's Judah, here's Ephraim, all of the tribes that make up the area. Judah is where? It's in the south, but particularly where? Jerusalem, and in the surrounding areas. That's where J takes place. Oftentimes the way we know that it's J is either because of the name of God or because of the Hebrew. J uses older Hebrew. Now, what does it mean when I say that J uses older Hebrew? As opposed to earlier Hebrew.
It's the early stories.
Well, maybe it's early stories.
The linguistic.
It's a linguistic thing. There are certain words that you'll see in a J tradition that you won't see in a D tradition.
And the alphabet's different. It's closer to the
Phoenician and
Yeah.
Proto-Canaanite
Proto-Canaanite.
Languages,
And
right?
are
So,
some of those words untranslatable?
yes, we actually have a phrase for those kinds of words. They're called hapax legomenos, or legomenum, which is basically, these are words that we don't know what they mean. And the reason we don't know what they mean is because they're loan words that were probably borrowed from other Semitic languages and thrown into the text.
Like Adonai.
Let's hold that one for now, okay?
Like dolphin skin.
Like dolphins. No, that's just a bad translation. But I have to tell you, dolphins were rampant in the wilderness. Just popped out of the sand. That's great. Okay? I also gave you the time for when we think these texts were written based on the chart above. And E is primarily the northern kingdom. So what you're seeing is that there's this idea that at the same time people are living in one place and living in another place, they're writing stories to reflect their understanding of what's going on around them. How many of you have ever read a book about the land of Israel? Who has read a book about the land of Israel? How many of you have read more than one book about the land of Israel? How many of you in reading more than one book about the land of Israel notice that there's differences between the way one author writes it and the way another author writes it? Okay, this is very similar to what's going on here. And eventually some dude named Redactor, he was really angry at his parents for a long time for naming him Redactor, came in and said, you know what, we need to harmonize these stories. So if you look, yeah.
So the question is, what was the goal of the redactor?
Great question.
Was it political? Was it theological? Was it?
It's a great question. And the answer is probably everything. The goal was, how do I take this story and make it fit in with this story? If we just say that God wrote the Torah, we don't have a problem. Why?
There's nothing to decide.
There's nothing to decide. Everything was there, and we have to understand what the reason was. But if it really did have this story and this story, and we brought them together, there must be a reason for it. You would never know that there was multiple authorships until I gave you a coloring book that says, wait a second, something isn't right here. What is the major author of this chapter of the Torah? E. E. Now, how do you know that?
It's in dark.
Because it's in the color. Good, thank you, Ellen. It's in dark green. That's how we know every now from now on. If you see something in dark green, okay, you know it's E. Okay? If you see that bag over there, that bag was written by J. But if you look at Sandy, she was written by E. Okay.
But the, again, if you looked at
Good. If you look at the Hebrew, you notice that there's a particular use of a name of God, which is Elohim. One of the things I would like for you to start doing if you're reading the text is notice which name of God is being used, because it tells us something, right? The opening line of this portion says, "Vayehi achar hadvarim ha'eleh," which is a famous way of saying a bunch of time has passed. Veha Elohim nisa et Abraham. Elohim tested Abraham.
And why did they use Elohim?
Good. Okay, now we're asking questions that are really pertinent to what we're trying to understand. Why use the name Elohim?
Because of God's element.
Okay, that may be one reason, because we're talking about a God named El. And where does the God named El live?
northern.
The north.
In the northern kingdom. In the northern kingdom.
But it was the earlier name of God.
It was an earlier name of God.
Yeah.
We actually don't know where the name of Adonai comes from yet. We haven't gotten there. And by that I don't mean to say that it's not in the Torah, but we're not officially introduced to God as Adonai until we get to the book of Exodus. Moses is the first person who really knows God as Adonai. Right? I am the Lord your God. You know, we have that in the Ten Commandments, but also we have this idea that God is, actually we just read it last week. God is Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh. So God is, I am that I am, that I'll be what I'll be, a process, something, but somehow connected to this name of Adonai. In our story, verses 1 through 10 and verses 16 through 19 are all affiliated with which author? E. What happened in the middle? The redactor came in. Before we figure out what that means, before we try to understand that even the redactor was there, let's say I never told you that this whole thing was color coordinated. If you just look at the text, for those of you who have your Chumash in Hebrew, or even if you don't, look at verse 11, page 65, or verse 11 on page 120 in the Chumash. If I'm looking at the text critically, I have to ask some questions about what's happening in the language.
So Rabbi Adonai now.
Vayikra elav malach Adonai. A messenger or an angel of Adonai calls from heaven and says to Abraham, Abraham, and he says, Hineni, I am here. Vayomer al tishlach yadacha el hana'ar vel ta'as lo me'uma. Don't take your hand and strike the lad. Ki ata yadati ki yireh Elohim ata. Because I know that you are fearing of Elohim. Wait a second.
We've got both of them.
We got both of them in there.
It's even better. Yahweh is talking about Elohim.
Yes, well, hold on, we'll get there, we'll get there. Hold on. All right? Tavalo chasachta b'chaycha min meni. You have not withheld your son from me. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell on a ram caught in the thicket. So Abraham took the ram and offered up in place. And Abraham named the site Adonai Yireh. Yahweh sees. Asher Yamar Hayom Bahar Adonai Yireh. Because on this place, Adonai saw or had a vision. So what's the questions that we need to ask about this text? Forget authorship for a second.
Why was an angel involved instead of God?
Good. Why an angel involved?
Why
instead of
the
God?
change in-
Why the change in name? By the way, look what happens as soon as you get to verse 16. We go back to Elohim. Okay, verses 16 and whatever, we go back to E. Why do we change the text?
Because it's dark green.
Because it's dark green. Yes,
We're
Jerry.
back to that.
So where does that mean?
So obviously, there's a change of what the author wants to be expressing in the story.
Great.
Because there's,
Starting.
some have said, there's this implication that we don't know from the E story what actually happened. And somehow there's this desire, for whatever reason,
Yep.
to make a different story or a
Yep.
different concept involved here.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, this result here, saying that because you didn't withhold your son, would work with either version of the story.
Yes.
Either killing Isaac or not killing him.
Good. So let's talk about that for a second. Let's say I read the story the following way. I'm in verse 10. And Abraham put out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And then I'm skipping to verse 16. And he said, I swear by me that because you did this thing and didn't withhold your son, your only one, that I'll bless you and multiply your seed. If I read the story that way, what happened? He killed Isaac.
But how's he gonna multiply his seed if he just killed his son? Who knows?
Yeah,
Doesn't it? I don't know.
Yeah,
Well,
Ishmael.
except
Could
that,
be Ishmael. Could be
Plural.
to me, it doesn't say definitively that he killed his son.
Right.
It's, and there's a lot of detail about the wood and on
Good,
his back,
good,
and he
good.
lifted the knife, and he's holding the knife, and yet, even though he never says, and he
That's
slayed
right.
his son.
Oh.
And so the redactor may be saying, we don't know if he slayed him or he didn't slay him.
Well, go back
If-
to
if
19.
he-
Look at 19
If he
though.
did slay him, and in this day and age, we need to make that okay.
Yep.
And so I'm gonna put this in, or if he didn't slay him, we need to come up with a reason why Abraham's still a
Yeah.
hero, and that he was still following God, and the covenant was all
Great,
still there.
great. So I want to say
Why
what
did
Barbara
Isaac
said
come
in a
back?
different way. Hold on one second. I want to say it a different way because I think everything you said is great. But there's something else that's hard in the text. The text is intentionally ambiguous. If I take out that middle section that was put in, or let's say it a different way. Let's make an argument for a moment that there was a part of the text that was put in later at some other time. If I take that out, it may look like he killed him. And not only that, look at verse 19. Abraham went back to his boys, meaning the lads that he brought with him, and they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba. It doesn't say that they went back. Now, why is that important?
Because he may have killed him. That explains it. That would.
Or more than that,
He killed him.
there's several times prior to where it says they walked together.
Right. And now they went out.
And now he just goes back by himself. So linguistically speaking, it's weird, it's bizarre, it's perplexing. We need to ask why, if every single time they're walking together, at the end of the story he goes back by himself, what happened to Isaac?
But he doesn't know what happened.
What does that mean?
Huh.
What does that mean?
He knows, or the stories say, that he went up, and then he come down, but they don't know what happened.
Okay, that's one possible answer, and it's a good answer. Stan?
The great redactor giveth and the great redactor taketh away. He could have eliminated,
I don't think I can use that in the funeral.
the redactor could have eliminated the E text which said he killed him. So to deliberately have
That's right, you don't
confusion
know
to
what
be
he
able
said.
to add those lines. If he hadn't taken out those lines, why would you have an insertion there which says that he was spared? So when you redact, you have the ability to add or subtract.
So let's talk about that for a second. Who here has ever done editing?
Yeah.
Have you ever edited a paper or an essay for yourself or for someone else? What's the hard part about editing?
What to leave in, what to leave out.
Good. What's leave in, what's leave out? What else?
Continuity.
Yeah.
Continuity. What
If
else?
it's your voice or somebody else's voice.
Good. Who's the voice that's
Who's the
actually
voice
speaking?
that's-
Good. What else is hard about editing?
Context.
Context.
Yeah.
How do I know that just taking out this
It isn't
phrase
going to change.
isn't going to radically change everything else that's around it?
If he edited it, why didn't he add in here that they walked down together?
Right.
Question. Why only edit the middle parts, but nothing about the E-text? If anything, he leaves the E-text intact,
Did he? Maybe he eliminated part of the
Well-
text.
or he took another fragment and
Right.
threw it in there to create a story.
He,
No,
he
but-
picked he said
but his point
Abraham
is-
picked up the knife. Maybe he eliminated what came after that.
Could be. We don't know. Maybe there's an ellipsis afterward and we just have to intuit.
Right.
So because there's a.
Hold on, Bob.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. Go ahead.
Well, it seems to me that the redactor's job is to reconcile competing narratives.
Mm,
And that's going to be really tough when they don't align.
good.
Right. Well,
Which, by the way, happens all the time in the Torah.
which is part of what I was going to say, is it's interesting, this is all E, and from what I was reading, a lot of what comes after is J, not E. So
Look at
was there-
chapter 23.
It's all, so the question is, was there even a J story that had this, you know, and what, you know, why is there no J that the redactor
Right.
is pulling together? It
Right.
makes me
Look
wonder.
at 23 for a second. Who, according to Friedman, wrote 23? P. Which makes sense because we're dealing with the purchasing of land. Land is connected to covenant, and we're buying land for a burial plot for Sarah. But let's say we took out chapter 23 and we went right back to chapter 24, which is the time when he needs to get a wife for Isaac. Who wrote 24?
It's all J.
It's all J. Now, why is this important? Let's say, for example, that I skipped everything else that was written before that was E, which is everything about Sarah, everything about Hagar, everything about the binding of Isaac, and whatnot. We could literally go from the beginning of chapter 1 that she becomes pregnant, she has a son, he grows up, and then he finds him a wife.
Right.
You can literally take out that whole middle section, it's completely unnecessary.
He doesn't return until chapter 25 when Abraham takes the second one.
That's right.
But doesn't, now who writes that Ishmael and Isaac both came to bury him?
Okay, so that's at the very end of the story. So at the very end of the story, it says,
What page is that?
it's on page 72. Oh wait, no, I'm sorry, I went too far.
When did they bury Abraham?
It's on page 71, and it's P. Verse 9, and Isaac and Ishmael his sons buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is also the P story before from when he bought the land.
Do we
So-
know that this is chronological?
I would not read any of this chronologically.
So the binding of Isaac may have come
Necessarily.
after getting him a wife.
Could be.
We don't know.
We don't know the timing, and there's a very clear sense that you shouldn't try to read it as chronologically being written. Phil?
Also, take a look at the verse right before 22. And Abraham resided in the land of the Philistines a long time.
Yep.
That's very much related because the Philistines had child sacrifice. They found burial
Yes.
plots with lots of baby bones and cypress,
Yes.
and passing the baby through the fire to Molech.
That's
and
true. And where are the Philistines?
On the coast?
Right there,
They're on the coast, but
next to
specifically
Gaza.
near Gaza, but they're considered part of the northern kingdom.
Really?
I think so. I wouldn't call them part of Judea.
Yeah, they're their own land.
Sea people, something.
Yes.
I mean, they're off to the side here, right? So Philistines are here.
Yes.
Benjamin and Judah are right in here. So I wouldn't call them part, I mean, maybe for the classification purposes, but they're not necessarily connected to the southern kingdom in terms of its form.
But they have this L practice.
Yes, that is
of
correct. They do
killing
have an L
children.
practice, and as a result, there's influence.
So how do we know we're talking about the Jewish L? Maybe we're talking about the Philistine L.
We're not sure, but El in general tends to be a non-Jewish or non-Israelite god,
That's my point.
right? So, before we go any further, who has questions about where we are right now? Why are you laughing? All right.
Where or what it's about.
No, just to understand the way that the different streams have come together. Does everyone understand up till now that we could read the story of the binding of Isaac as multiple traditions being woven together to create one story? Does everyone see that? Does everyone see that the two possible stories is one that wants to talk about God as El, and one that wants to talk about God as Adonai? Barbara? Are you sure?
Yes.
It's okay if you're not. I mean, it's also okay if you're not sure, but... Okay, yeah.
I'm just wondering if in ancient times, if the people, you know, who got the Torah's the Torah,
Yep.
if they questioned, it had the same kind of questions.
Yeah.
Like, how come you're calling, God sometimes Adonai and sometimes Adonai?
Yeah.
I just wonder if, that was happening. Nobody knows, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, we could say it a different way. What is the motivation of the redactor in putting in this particular passage? Why would an author who's looking through the text, who's just read this whole thing about slaughtering Isaac, whether he did it or not, we're not sure, why would a redactor want to put in the insertion the way that they did?
To end child sacrifice.
That's one possibility, right?
He doesn't want God to come off as this mean, awful God.
That's one possibility, not to have God come off as a mean awful God.
I
Yeah.
think you should continue the story.
Continue the story.
Isn't Jay trying to have the depth of the story here? And if they were trying, Friedman says that when E came down after the destruction of the Northern Kingdom and they're coming south into the land of Judahites, they bring their stories with them. So now you've got to, so all the E people knew their stories, all the J people knew their stories.
Yes. But ultimately, what does it mean to have a J story or an E story?
Point of view.
More specifically.
It's your story.
More
Your
specifically.
identification.
With
God.
a God.
What's your conceptual?
That's right.
Conceptualization
A J
of God?
story is conceiving of God as Adonai, and an E story is conceiving of God as Elohim.
But they
You have a battle going on here between gods.
But they
Why,
couldn't.
why did the
they couldn't-
redactor use both?
Good question. We'll get to that one second.
But they couldn't reject the E tradition coming from the south. They had to combine it.
Yes, but they do something even more powerful. Who commands Isaac to kill his son? Which God?
Elohim.
E. Which God swoops in and saves the day?
Jay.
There you go, Israel and Judah.
Everyone got it?
Yeah.
Which God commands Abraham to kill his son? E. Elohim, Northern Kingdom, God that's worshipped by lots of different people. Who is the God that the redactor puts in who comes in and saves the day? J.
And that breaks E, because E, the word E is for on high. So if Y is above E, then E is no longer high. So
An I
it is
before
the-
E, except after C.
Exactly.
Right? But
A Y
the
before
redactor
E.
wants-
the
Elohim.
redactor wants Adonai to win.
Yeah.
If Elohim wins, then we have to follow the practice of Elohim. If Adonai wins, you can do things like reject child sacrifice. Or you can say, look how loyal Abraham was to Adonai. And by the way, look at the text in terms of how Adonai enters the scene. And an angel of Adonai called him from the skies and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, I'm here. Who does the work of Adonai? The angel. In general, how do we experience God between the two? Look on your chart for a second. In J, Yahweh, God walks and talks with us. But in E, God speaks to him in a dream. We actually don't know how God speaks to Abraham in the opening verses. But here, why do you think Adonai would send an angel or a messenger to intervene? Why doesn't God do it God's self?
Noahs aren't used to having a direct communication with God.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is sort of softening it.
Okay, good. So we have a more direct communication, an actual like hands-on approach, so to
It's not
speak.
your God, but he's acting more like it.
Okay, good. What else? By the way, it's like kind of a reach out and stopping him, right? Like there's an actual interaction that's happening here, as opposed to I heard from God to go do this.
Want to get rid of the anthropomorphic stuff.
Good.
It sort of indicate that Yahweh has some human characteristics. Because
That's
why
true.
He can walk and talk.
God can walk and talk, but why else? Why doesn't God do it God's self? Why doesn't Adonai intervene?
Because at the beginning, God's telling him one thing, and so
And?
it'd be conflicting with what God had said previously in terms of at the very beginning, he's doing the commanding there
Yes.
of what to do, and so you want something different.
In the
I think.
first story, Elohim is telling Abraham what to do. You might think that if God tells me something, I need to do it. But if God intervenes directly in the second story, you might get confused. But there's probably one other reason. Adonai wants to divorce God's self, Adonai's self, from this entire scenario. Adonai had nothing to do with this. Adonai would never tell you to kill your son. That's not the kind of God that Adonai is. Elohim would totally do it. And how do we know? Phil, how do we know?
Because he's the one who commands him to do it.
God's Elohim is doing it all around the area at the time. In the Philistines, right? Everyone is being killed.
And they talk about it, the fire of Moloch.
Is it a positioning thing perhaps that an angel of Adonai is more powerful than the god El? Because the angel can tell
Nice.
Abraham not to do what El has commanded.
That is correct.
And meanwhile, Adonai is still above the angel.
Exactly. And by the way, that's so much of what we have at stake here. This is the battle of gods. This is what's going on in the Torah. We're talking about a story where you have competing power between gods, and one God needs to emerge supreme.
So why would Adonai care that Abraham, that he's happy that Abraham has now listened to the word of Elohim?
Why? Wait, say it again.
Well, over here it said that the angel of God said, "Don't do this."
Yep.
And now that it's known that you fear you and you will listen to Elohim. Is that what he said here?
Yes, that your God,
fearing. So why would God be happy that he listened to Elohim?
Well, God fearing.
Gods.
You're talking about in verse. What verse are you in?
So here where it said, and Abraham raised his son to it said, don't put. Okay, so the angel of Adonai called him to these guys and said, Abraham, don't put your hand on the boy, don't do anything, because I now know that you fear Elohim.
I see. So Jerry's asking the question, if we're trying to change what's going on in the story by redacting it to be about Adonai, why in the middle do we have both? That's what you're saying?
Yeah, if you're saying the competing gods, why would Adonai care that he feared Elohim?
Good question. Got it. Anyone want to venture a guess?
You can fear but not kill.
Okay.
Because
Wait,
at the beginning of the story, you had Elohim, and so there's some consistency in it to make it more palatable to
Yeah.
understand it, I think.
Right. So most likely, what were we going to say?
Yeah, you want to show the power of Adonai over Elohim, so you're saying, he believed, he feared Elohim, but I'm the man.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I'm the
That's what he
God.
said. Right. So I think it's a combination of the two. On the one hand, it is a way of being able to acknowledge that Adonai is more powerful than Elohim. On the other hand, I think what you have here is a reconciliation of two different narratives. And so the only way to really try to reconcile them so that it doesn't feel so distant from the first is to use similar language that existed in the first part of the story. Right?
Okay, so there were two choices. The writers could have just rejected the Elohim stuff.
Yep.
And said, our Torah is just going to have the Adonai stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people from the north would be up in arms and they would not like that. Instead, he does it subtly. Well, they're not stupid.
Yes.
I mean, so he has them fighting and Adonai prevails and Elohim gets kicked out.
Yes.
It's the same result.
That's true, except that there's a historical problem. J and E are being written early. Right? We're talking about in the 8th century BCE and the 7th century BCE, while the Northern Kingdom is still very strong, before they collapse in 722, and really before the priests kind of take over. All right? The challenge that we have with our story is that so much of the emphasis of Adonai, of J, of Yahweh, doesn't actually appear on the scene until we get out of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis, if you could characterize the book of Genesis, what would you call it? How would you describe it?
Ancient
It's a
history.
prequel.
Ancient history.
And myth.
Prequel,
A
myth.
prequel to Yahweh.
What'd you say?
A prequel to
A
Yahweh.
prequel to Yahweh. Creation.
In the beginning.
In the beginning. It's what we would call the patriarchal period.
It's a transition.
Right. It's a transition. And so we actually don't see Adonai officially come to power, officially gain status, until chapter 3 of the book of Exodus, which is when Moses has an experience in the burning bush.
But if you killed off Isaac, you can't have any of that story.
Of course. So we have to keep Isaac in the story. But why are we keeping Isaac in the story? Because this is a patriarchal narrative. Every piece of the text always points back to the tradition between the Israelites and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not that we couldn't change it to Abraham, Ishmael, and Jacob, or just Abraham and Jacob. It would change, with the Amidah a little bit. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Jacob, Yaakov, and we would skip Isaac.
Isn't that the whole Muslim thing, is that they all came from Ishmael, not from Isaac? I don't know what they, do they think that Isaac was killed? Was he
There's a
sacrificed?
debate. There's a debate in the Quran about if he was or wasn't killed, and there's also debate as to who was put on the altar.
So you're saying at the time the redactor was doing his work, Adonai wasn't strong enough yet? Hadn't been as developed yet? So he
Yeah.
wanted to go in through the back door and do it more subtly?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting way to characterize it.
Well,
I
As
don't.
opposed to just leaving out the whole...
I think part of what you're seeing here is what we would call monolatry. Right? Monolatry is the idea that you have multiple gods in the universe, but one god is more powerful than the rest. Right? Just like you kind of have in Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Egyptian mythology. Right? One god is more supreme than others. This is not a denial of El, by the way. This is just saying that Adonai is more powerful than El. So even if El is the god of the Philistines, or the god of the Canaanites, or the god of other ancient civilizations, this is a story about Adonai trying to make headway, trying to insert Adonai's self into the narrative so that we can recognize that Abraham's ultimate relationship with God is with Adonai and not with El. Did everyone follow what I just said? Jerry?
Yeah.
No, that Jerry. Back now. There's a lot of Jerrys.
I understand.
Did you? Your face told me otherwise.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Well, you could take the position that if you have these warring factions, or
Yeah.
that you want to combine somehow or integrate, one way to do it is to just eliminate the victor eliminates the traditions and the culture, or tries to,
Right.
of the north. In this case, the north.
Right.
And that doesn't work very well. It takes a long time. The other way is to co-opt them, is to merge them in some way, keeping yours ahead at
Yeah.
the top. But it's an easier transition. It's easier to get those people to buy in.
Right. So I'm going to ask the question that I started with. When we started the class today, we talked about what is the binding of Isaac about. We talked about it through the lens mostly of a spiritual theological frame, right? It's about obedience, loyalty, faith, testing, maybe ending sacrifice, not clear. Maybe it's about actually saying that we want to know if the promise that God made to Abraham will be fulfilled, right? Or is he going to die and there's going to be a problem? That's the traditional spiritual. That's okay. But in terms of if we look at it critically speaking, what other layers of interpretation do we add to the story?
Maybe.
Go ahead.
Politics.
Politics.
I was thinking we preserve both traditions.
Good, we preserve both traditions. What else?
Well, politics in the sense of you have to perpetuate whoever your leader is. In this
Okay.
case, they got to keep Isaac in, or some story about Isaac going
Good.
to Judah
Good.
eventually.
What else? Yeah.
Quite often in the Torah, in the footnotes, they'll say that this particular section may be a little confusing because it seems to represent part of a narrative that no longer was included, or a story that was well known at the time,
Yes.
and perhaps was omitted because it was well known.
Yes.
So there are things happening that we don't know about,
Yes.
and it's very difficult to assume what may have been, and then whose story may that have been.
May actually be a way of introducing historical context,
Yes.
right? This may be a way of reflecting back other kinds of stories that were happening like this. Let's go with the child sacrifice thing for a second. We do know that it existed, right? We do know that other faiths were doing it. This may be our own narrative, but we have a different outcome because our God would never let us do that. But we actually have to name that God. We have to differentiate our God from their God. Okay, what? Yeah.
But did that God
allow human sacrifice at one point because Abraham doesn't question it
Yeah.
at all. You know, it's
He
like
did.
it's a norm.
Right, right, it's a great question.
And then what went on before?
Right.
Sure.
And so was this the break here?
You can make the argument that this is the break.
But did Adonai previously?
Right,
Allow.
and there's a lot more we have to dig into because not only is there a question about child sacrifice or sacrifice in general, Adonai is not shy when it comes to intervening or killing lots of people or whatnot, as is Elohim. They both have their day in the sun, so to speak. So, but yeah, I think you're asking the right question.
I think that actually it's much, much stronger than we're saying. Take a look at King Ahab, right? I think
You have to
Ahab,
give some context to that.
okay, so Ahab's married to Jezebel, and Ahab is the king of Israel, and he brings the practice of the worship of Baal to the temple. Baal is the same thing as El.
It's another
the same-
Canaanite god.
It's another
The
Canaanite.
name of a Canaanite god.
And then Jezebel was trying to eradicate Yahweh. And then there were the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Yahweh, and it's a significant part of the Torah. And then they literally had to battle each other, and then Yahweh won, and then they killed all of the prophets of Baal. And this was an earlier history. So we know within...
You may know the story differently. You may know the story about Elijah. Elijah the prophet who goes up on the mountain and he does this whole big magical spectacle
Yeah.
where all of the worshipers of Baal think that their gods are so great that they can do whatever. And Elijah says, well, I got Adonai. And they end up having this big battle. It's one of the Haftarot that we read. And it's a story all about, Elijah baiting them, saying, if your God is so great, let your God strike this place, and nothing happens, and then Adonai comes in and totally wipes out everything. And so much of the ancient stories have to do with competing tension around which God is more powerful. If you think about Hanukkah for a second, and let's say for a moment that we make the argument that Hanukkah was about a civil war between the Zealots, the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, right, the people who were priests and followed the true practice of the priestly system, versus the assimilated, Hellenized Jews. People who become assimilated or Hellenized start to adopt the customs and the practices of the people around them, which would include Greek culture and their gods. So what is Hanukkah ultimately about? Then it becomes a story about which God do we worship? The Greek gods or Adonai? And so you start to see those things come off the page a little bit when you read the stories this way.
What Karen said has an interesting implication.
Go ahead.
Prior to this story, Adonai existed. I mean, he has a covenant with Abraham.
Yeah.
And he allowed things to happen that certainly now he's taking a stand, and there are probably other examples. So what it's saying is Adonai has the ability to change,
Yeah.
and that his moral standards are not absolutes necessarily.
That is correct. And not only that, Moses is the best person to look at because Moses can convince God to change Adonai's mind. And it actually happens on several occasions in the Torah where you would think that Adonai or God would respond in one way, but humanity has the ability to influence. And we actually have a great example of it with Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
Abraham does it with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Mm-hmm. Which really has implications to modern day and
Totally.
the practice of
Is it
Judaism.
Adonai or Elohim with whom Abraham has the
Yeah,
covenant?
Right, so that's part of what we have to look at, and we would have to understand. Well, there's actually more than one covenantal ceremony with
Yes, I
Abraham.
understand.
Okay, but this wasn't the first time Adonai appeared.
No, Adonai appears earlier.
Right,
Adonai appears earlier.
okay.
Okay, so we're going to pause here.
And how confusing is it that Elijah's name is Elijah?
Yeah.
Because it's El and Jah.
So I just want to check in with you. Was this better today? We doing okay? Have I still totally confused you? Okay.
And this is a story.
This is a story that you know. This is a story that you can hopefully relate to. But I'm also hoping that in you reading stories that you'll start to ask different questions about what's going on in the text. Where are there deviations? Where are there words that seem to be out of place or language that seems to be different that causes us to read the text?
This explanation, I think, made the story.
Say it again.
This explanation, they made